Right. So let's start our presentation, our session. But first, I would love to introduce our great speakers for today, Lunch and Learn. So let's start with Halley Silversides. Uh, Halley is a mental health registered nurse, research and information professional, and PhD candidate in the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary. With an interdisciplinary background in anthropology, history, library science, and nursing, her research focuses on newcomers, emotional wellness, clinical mental health with vulnerable populations, and community knowledge translation across healthcare and community settings. Our next speaker is Alesia Au. Alesia is a second generation immigrant, registered nurse, and community based researcher with over 8 years of experience in immigrant and refugee health research. She holds a Master of Nursing research from University of Alberta. Her work spans clinical practice, research coordination, and community partnerships, focusing on the health and well-being of immigrant, refugee, and racialized communities through equity-oriented, community-engaged research. Last but not least, our speaker, Grace Brown. Grace immigrated from Chile and is a registered nurse specializing in mental health. Her works at she works at the Arnica Center, supporting individuals and families with intellectual disabilities and complex mental health. Grace is completing her Master of Nursing at the University of Calgary, and her thesis focuses on interpretation services and improving communication and access to mental health care for patients with limited English proficiency. Wonderful. Without any further ado, I would love now to pass it over to our speakers. So feel free to share your screen, and we are all looking forward to the session today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rafi, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to the Immigrant Services Calgary for hosting us today. So this is Halley speaking. I apologize for not having my camera on. I'm located in Europe, and right now there is a heat wave that is affecting a lot of our telecommunications infrastructure. So I am trying to keep my bandwidth as low as possible to make sure that you can hear me, which I think is probably more important. So thank you again, and I will get started. So today we're going to be talking about how we support newcomers through a nursing-informed lens. And the three of us will all speak in different kind of ways to this phenomena around how we support newcomers based on our own experiences, both clinically through nursing, but also through our various research works. So just to get us started, I wanted to talk about some key vocabulary and some of the ways that we approach the work, all three of us as nurses. Nursing perspectives can offer the settlement sector a lot of different things, but they're based fundamentally in what nursing science is. And a lot of these are key factors that likely overlap with your own practice in settlement work. Things like person-centered care, the therapeutic use of self, right? So the ways in which we work with our clients. Nursing operates from a biopsychosocial, also spiritual model, which is very similar to medicine. And we also operate from a model of client empowerment, and we're here to empower the people that we work with. So what makes nursing different is often compared to medicine. So although medicine has become more holistic and patient-centered over the years, there's still a lean towards diagnostic medicine and treating disease. Whereas the role of nursing is a bit different, and this impacts our lens and the way that we work. We view people as whole people first, who happen to be experiencing a disease or happen to be experiencing something. And this makes sense. Doctors diagnose and they prescribe. Whereas fundamentally, the role of the nurse is caring and meeting the client where they're at. So a good example of this in a mental health context is depression. So a psychiatrist will take the full history, they'll explore diagnoses, and they'll provide treatment, whether that be medication or maybe therapy. whereas the role of the nurse is to support the person through the process by listening to their needs, perhaps capturing perspectives that were missed that influence their plan of care, or ability for that person to actually manage their care. So some other key terms that I want to address just as we get started here are the differences between mental health, emotional wellness, and belonging, because often they're used interchangeably, but they do mean different things. So first off, mental health, and this is the World Health Organization definition of this, which is a state of psychological, emotional, and social well-being. And then moving to the right here, we have emotional wellness. And emotional wellness is in some ways a bit more granular than mental health, but in some ways it's actually a bit more broad. Largely, emotional wellness is the ability to understand and manage the stresses of everyday life. But this includes things like the ability to regulate one's emotions, connections that we have, and our own resilience. So naturally, emotional wellness plays a huge role in newcomer acculturation and integration. And lastly, here we have belonging. So belonging is this feeling of being accepted, connected, and valued within a group, place, or community. Belonging is a key part of emotional wellness, and this is something that we'll thread through our presentation today. So while I've spent a really big chunk of my research career working within the immigrant and newcomer research space, over the last few years, I've taken some time to flirt with other mental health research areas, particularly clinically focused research, and to work on my PhD, which explores how inpatient mental health nurses use knowledge in their practice environments, including how they work with newcomers. I don't feel like I'm old enough for a career retrospective at this point. So what I'm going to do over the next few slides is talk about some of the key projects I've been involved with, the main takeaways, and why this matters to you folks as settlement practitioners, which will be guided by research results, but also my own understanding as a mental health nurse, who often works with newcomers as part of my emergency mental health practice. So the first major newcomer research project I was involved with was the Renew Project. This is the Refugee and Newcomer Emotional Wellness Partnership for Best Practices. And this came about in 2018. The Renew Project came out of a partnership between the Faculty of Nursing at the University of Calgary and the Immigrant Education Society under the leadership of the late Dr. Cesar Suva. And while most immigrant serving agencies have developed a patchwork of different programs designed to meet the mental health needs of their newcomer clients, there was little evidence of which of these programs were effective or not, nor if they were actually meeting the needs of clients anecdotally, or if they were meeting the needs of settlement practitioners. So this was a 3-year IRCC-funded research partnership with 4 partner sites across Western Canada. So that was between Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So what we found out is, unsurprisingly, clients were largely concerned about acculturative and adjustment-related stress experienced during the settlement process. And there are ongoing issues of access related to community and municipal supports, especially City of Calgary and that type of thing, for both staff and clients. So in terms of where we can refer people, as well as where clients can actually go themselves in a meaningful way. The operating environment, including how programs are funded, of settlement agencies imposes some structural constraints on offering supports that are closer to home, where clients actually have easier access. And frontline staff are often compelled to act beyond their scope of practice when client needs are more immediate or urgent. And this was somewhat unexpected. I think the earlier results that I was talking about were things that we anticipated, but one thing that we learned is that frontline staff operate in ways that they have to, not necessarily within their scope of practice as educators or within their scope of practice as settlement practitioners, right? We figured that we would confirm some of these obvious things that staff were seeing, but what we found is that staff often go above and beyond their role to meet the needs of clients. And you know what, this makes sense, especially as you get to know your clients. You want to do the best you can by them. You get involved with people and with families, right? I certainly know that from my own nursing practice and seeing people multiple times, and you want to do the best you can by that person, even if you have to step outside of perhaps your own comfort zone, but also your professional scope. So unfortunately, the Renew study had to shut down early because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we did follow up around this idea of scope of practice and feeling prepared to take on a more challenging role than maybe you initially signed up for. So I spoke with many settlement practitioners and link teachers who went above and beyond to help newcomers and still felt like they weren't doing enough. So from an instructional perspective, what we found is that a lot of instructors felt challenged by the emotional wellness difficulties that clients face in their classroom. And we will come back to this. So switching gears a little bit, after this work, I became involved with Dr. Anusha Kassan's research with the Immigrant Education Society on child language brokering. Child language brokering is when newcomer children translate and interpret for their families. Dr. Kassan has done a ton of work in this area, and I would argue she's a leading scholar in this area. And all of the findings related to child language brokering can be found in this book, which is linked here, which I'm an editor on, and this is my shameless plug for today. Obviously, the dynamic of child language brokering impacts the mental health of the child. In these situations, they can be placed into uncomfortable roles that they may not necessarily feel prepared for. For example, translating and interpreting for their parents at banks or at doctor's appointments. And I've seen this firsthand in my own mental health assessment practice, and I'm sure many of you have seen this dynamic at play in your own work environments. So how do we make an impact on the emotional well-being of newcomers who manage things like child language brokering? Is this phenomenon always negative? Not necessarily. So depending on how the child is prepared and the want of the child to participate, these experiences can actually be okay for both the parent and child. So then how do we support this healthy dynamic when kids are translating for their parent? A few key things would be checking in with the child, making sure like, hey, is this okay? What's going on here? Do they need some support from you? And then making sure the family is aware of the impacts on their child, interpreting and translating, but to facilitate these types of conversations without judgment. If this is of interest to you, or you find that this phenomenon happens a lot in your practice, I highly recommend checking out this book. It's available for free through the University of Calgary Library Prism. And there's much more detail around what we found and recommendations for how we can support newcomer parents and their children in these types of interactions. So all of this to say, scope of practice really matters. And scope of practice really is about who does what with whom. And what we found with Renew is that link teachers, particularly, but not exclusively, were doing a lot of emotional wellness support that they didn't necessarily feel prepared to provide. What this led to was a significant practitioner burnout and stress. However, we also found that there's an importance around organizational navigation. So knowing where to go when you need it. And I know this sounds pretty obvious, but sometimes it's a nice reminder around, do you know the resources available within your organization? So, if you're working for ISC today, do you know everything that ISC has available to you that you can refer your clients to? Do you know where you can refer your clients out to outside of the organization? And this type of wayfinding practice is incredibly important. It also begs the question of, do we have enough resources in order to tackle some of the emotional wellness concerns within classrooms and within settlement conversations? And ultimately leads to this bigger, broader question is, how do we support people, and is it even our role to do so? If I'm not feeling prepared to handle these emotional wellness concerns, am I actually the best person to do so? Maybe you are because you know the client really well, but maybe you're not because you don't necessarily feel prepared in order to do so. So what does this mean for your role? Like, if you end up in these situations, do you know what to do? And I asked this question a bit rhetorically, but it is something to reflect on. If you did end up in a really difficult conversation with a client, maybe around trauma, maybe around depression, maybe around a culture of stress, would you know what to do? Would you know where to go? I just want to say it's really important that you don't have to know how to do everything, and you don't have to do everything alone, even though sometimes it might feel like you have to, especially if you're one teacher in a classroom or you're one settlement practitioner working within a fairly siloed environment. It's important that we reach out to our colleagues. It's important that we reach out to our networks. We know what others do, and so we can create a referral network, but we can also create a network within our cultures that allow us to rely on one another and talk about these practice problems. Because the more that we talk about what's going on with our clients, the better equipped we'll all be together. So remember, the other piece of this is that organizational issues. So if you're finding these things happening a lot and there isn't necessarily those supports, organizational issues require organization level support. And therefore, it's important to talk about what's going on, especially with your leadership, because otherwise they might not know either. So at the end of the day, it's important to know your available organizational resources at Immigrant Services Calgary or whichever agency you belong to, as well as other key contacts that can help you support newcomer emotional wellness. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alesia. Thank you.
Thanks, Halley. So I'm going to take this presentation to a bit of a pivot. My thesis research when I was doing my master's was focusing on social belonging. But today I'm not here to try to solve the issue of belonging, but more so try to help give language of what you might be noticing in your practice and maybe some shifts that may be within your reach. So again, key to this conversation is that this is very much a systemic issue and it's real, but it's not for you to carry by yourself. So just to reiterate from before, belonging and emotional wellness are both deeply relational. In my work at the University of Alberta with Dr. Jordana Salma, we work with newcomers and migrants who are also older adults, and they may have been in Canada for as little as 2 months for up to all the way to 40 years. And across the board, we notice that the desire to belong is key to their quality of life. Now, to experience belonging, that does require four conditions. This is from an integrative literature review by Allen and authors. And requires the skill and abilities to belong, and that an example could be language skills. It requires the opportunities to engage, as well as the motivation or inner drive to want to connect with others. And finally, the perceived evaluation that they fit in. Feeling like you belong manifests as feeling seen, valued, and that you have something to contribute. Key to this is belonging is not a one-time achievement. Someone may have lived in Canada for many years and still experience loneliness or exclusion later in life. Things may shift, such as family roles, your health status, your mobility, your language, or even your social participation. So recognizing that belonging can change over time means that we must also recognize that the supports someone relies on may change over time. So the point to take with all of this is more so a lens that I have been using to understand someone's situation from. And for everyone else, this is not an assessment task. We're not in a position to measure or fix anyone's belonging, but simply by being curious of whether someone's support is meaningful, safe, and chosen by them is a first step to a better referral or looping in the right resources. So, family and community support are often important sources of emotional wellness. For example, in the case for older newcomers, their adult children and relatives who may be based locally in Canada or transnationally, alongside faith communities and ethnocultural organizations, may be of great support in order to navigate services, translate or interpret information, attend appointments, and stay socially connected. However, these supports should not be treated as a substitute for accessible systems. Sometimes family support can hide unmet needs unintentionally. For example, an older adult may say, "My daughter handles everything for me," but that does not necessarily mean that older adult feels informed, independent, or comfortable. And there may also be layers such as privacy concerns, especially when there are sensitive topics. We notice that some newcomers may not want to discuss financial stress, family conflict, health concerns, grief, or emotional struggles, either through a family member or burden a family member with their concerns. So this leads to the importance of helping to connect older adults to direct, confidential, and age-friendly supports. And notice when those supports may be missing, which Hallie has also kind of given that rhetorical task as well. However, actually building again these pathways and supports is an organizational level, and it takes more than one person to get there. When we talk about the concept of community, we often talk about it as a protective factor, and it absolutely can be. Ethnocultural, faith-based, language-specific spaces can offer that familiarity, shared language, cultural understanding, and social connection. However, no space is automatically safe or inclusive for everyone, and I think everyone can attest to that too here. And I want to be clear that this is not about singling out any one community. People may experience experience racism or xenophobia in broader mainstream society, and at the exact same time experience ageism, gendered expectations, disability or language barriers, or stigma within their own community spaces. And we've also seen that mainstream and dominant culture spaces can be quite exclusive at times. So, for example, an older immigrant woman may be referred to a cultural or faith-based program, but that program may not feel accessible if, for example, she has accessibility challenges in terms of mobility, or if the group that is there is much younger than her and she does not feel respected there. So this begins the question of, does that specific space feel safe, accessible, and empowering for this older immigrant woman or whichever individual we're working with? Does it make sense for their needs? Now, this is not a task to investigate or guarantee that any space is safe. It's more so understanding that whenever a referral or suggestion is made, whether it feels safe, requires that person-centered care, which was our nursing lens that Halley talked about in the beginning, where we kind of ask about that individual's comfort, their preferences, their access needs. And sometimes this takes time to kind of dig that information out and work with it. So the main message I'm trying to portray here is that belonging is not just a feeling. It really much is shaped by everyday interactions, referrals, programs, and the surrounding system. Everything in the last couple of slides come down to small shifts that I've outlined on the slide here, and I've split them into what you could try to talk about in a conversation versus what is part of the bigger picture, perhaps in your organization. So starting with your conversation, firstly asking about the quality of someone's support. So instead of just asking who is helpful to you, but more so who do you feel comfortable going to, or asking, are there some things that you would prefer to discuss with someone outside your family? Considering accessibility for this person that you're working with. For example, that program, if it's culturally familiar, but is it accessible, age-friendly, welcoming, and safe for that individual? Or what exactly are they looking for? Now, the tricky part with raising with your organization, this is me coming from a very idealistic, I guess, point of view, but to belong is to contribute, right? So being able to create opportunities for newcomers to contribute, that inquires to keep in mind that older immigrants may come with deep life experience, caregiving knowledge, professional skills, community leadership, and wisdom. Emotional wellness is supported when people are treated not only as service users, but also as knowledge holders, leaders, advisors, volunteers. And key to community-based practice is involving newcomers in shaping the programs and supports meant for them. In research, we call this co-design as well. But there's a couple of principles underneath all of what I've been saying. And it really comes from that nursing and community-based research practice lens of when it comes to building rapport, that has to come before we take any action. And this does take time, resources, and care. So our goal is to help newcomers act on their own agency, their own accord, whenever they can, rather than making choices for them. So now I'll hand it over to Grace, who will draw from her own experiences and how it's fed into her work now.
Thank you, Alicia, for the introduction. I apologize for my camera not working. I am not the best with technology, and my husband is on the background trying to fix it. So yeah, so I'm gonna introduce myself. My name is Grace. I immigrated to Canada from Chile in 2015 to pursue my education and build a new life. While this experience was exciting, it also came with many challenges. Today, I will share how my personal experiences as an immigrant and my professional experiences as a mental health nurse have influenced my research interest. Next slide, please. Moving to a new country involved many adjustments. Even though I could communicate in English, there were many times where I felt uncertain or unsure where to seek help. These experiences help me understand some of the challenges that many newcomers are facing when settling in Canada. Next slide, please. The process of starting over can have a significant impact on mental health and well-being. Newcomers are often balancing multiple stressors at once, which can contribute to feelings of anxiety, stress, loneliness, and uncertainty. Next slide, please. My own experiences as an immigrant have helped me to understand what it feels to navigate unfamiliar systems. In my nursing practice, I try to create a safe and supportive environment where patients feel comfortable sharing their concerns and asking questions. Next slide, please. Throughout my career, I have cared for many patients from many cultural and linguistic backgrounds. I have witnessed how language barriers can make it difficult for patients to communicate their thoughts, their feelings, their experiences, particularly in mental health settings. Slide 18, please. My thesis focuses on interpreter services in mental health care. I'm conducting a scoping review to understand what is currently known and what challenges exist and where the gaps remain in the literature. Next slide, please. Mental health relies heavily on communication. When patients cannot fully communicate with healthcare providers, it can affect their experience, treatment outcomes, and overall engagement in services. Next slide, please. Although my review is still ongoing, the literature consistently shows that professional interpreter services can improve communication and patient engagement in mental health settings. Several challenges continues to exist. Professional interpreters are not always available, and there is still limited research specifically focused on mental health settings and deaf populations. One of the most important lessons from this work is that language is much more about translating words. Effective communication requires trust, cultural understanding, opportunities for meaningful participation in care. Next slide, please. My research is meaningful to me because it connects me with my personal journey as an immigrant myself, and also my professional commitment to support patients in mental health settings. My hope is that my work contributes to more equitable, accessible, and person-centered care for newcomers and for linguistically diverse populations. Next slide, please. Thank you for taking the time to listen. We are welcoming any questions, comments, or discussions about my experiences, maybe Halley's experiences, maybe Alicia's experiences. In my view, I just want to make the system more inclusive for newcomers. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Halley, Alicia, and Grace, for the wonderful presentation and sharing all this knowledge and founding with us. So now we're going to open the floor for everyone. If you have a question, if you prefer to use the chat. Oh, okay, I think we have already a question in the chat. I'm thinking, or yeah, when thinking about immigrant support workers needing to step outside their scope of practice, how can moral injury potentially become a factor for support workers to navigate, and how?
I can take this one. This is
Sure, Halley, thank you.
Yeah, this is certainly up my alley in terms of my work and that type of thing. Because moral injury is so common, particularly among mental health and psychiatric nurses as well. I think anybody that works with vulnerable populations, moral injury is a risk factor, right? For your own burnout, for your own length in the profession, for your own satisfaction within your profession, right? So is it a factor? Absolutely, it can become a factor. And I think when you are exposed to repeated stories around trauma, and even when you are repeatedly having your back up against the wall, and what I mean by that is you know what you need to do in order to help this person, but there are so many barriers and constraints in the way that it makes it so challenging in order to do so. That wears on you after a while to the point where then you just stop doing it, right? So all of these things are really important considerations when you think about the scope of your work and thinking about, like I was mentioning before, what does your support village look like at work, right? How do you have colleagues that you can lean on? Do you have colleagues that you can also talk to about practice? Is leadership approachable if you are experiencing these types of things? And at the end of the day, the biggest thing here, and I hate this word in a lot of ways, but self-care, right? And I know that self-care isn't always easy, right? It always seems to be this band-aid word that we use, even though it's like, oh, self-care, okay, take a bubble bath. That will certainly help me from the last 4 months I've had with, working with people with complex PTSD. And it's like, of course it's not. What I mean, when I talk about self-care in this perspective, it might look a little bit different, right? It might look like, again, how can we lean on our colleagues? How can you do something maybe nice for yourself? Or maybe how can you reframe some of these situations that you might find yourself in, right? I hate feeling powerless, and I don't think I am unique in hating feeling powerless in my role. So what can I do to feel more empowered even in my own role? What's in my control? And sometimes it might not feel like much. Sometimes the only thing in my control is that immediate one-to-one interaction with my client. I can't control housing. I can't control transit. I can't control the psychiatrist. But what I can control is my empathy, my conversation with that client. And at the end of the day, that's what I have to remind myself of sometimes. So I would encourage you to adopt a similar mindset, right? Whatever is going to work well for you. And like I said, it's probably not the bubble bath. It's going to be these little everyday shifts in the way that we think about our work, especially when moral injury is a repeated occurrence. Thanks for the question. It's a really good one.
Thank you so much, Halley. Yes, it's a great question and absolutely great answer. And thank you for touching point on healthcare or self-help, because this is like more process than magic wounds or like pills at the end of the day.
I would like to add into that, if I may.
Sure, absolutely.
In my practice as a mental health nurse, I try to set healthy and professional boundaries while also remaining compassionate and understanding. It is also a good idea to debrief with colleagues, with your manager after encountering a challenging situation. As Halley was saying, self-care is important. Taking breaks throughout the day. Also continuing to learn about cultural safety and trauma-informed care. Um, and as I say, trying to engage in different activities outside work, because unfortunately, our kind of work can be quite challenging at times. We get to see clients in their worst time of their lives, and that impact us. So I think it is a good idea to maintain those boundaries and finding a way how to debrief and do some self-care. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Strongly agree with you. If there is any if there is no question, I have question actually. And I surprised Halley because I have hard copy of this book, and I will just put the link in the chat for Beyond Translation. I attend the launching for that book, and I had question because I also like working frontline with clients. Sometimes interpretation service is not available because many reasons. So my question is, sharing sensitive information or situation from the client to health providers, service providers, and the child is the interpreter. So how much we can like manage that if the decision involve in very sensitive topic. Also, another part of the question, how we can make sure if the child able to translate the medical terms, for example, even to their first language, spoken language, is kind of like hard to translate those terms. And I believe it's hard also to understand it in English.
No, for sure. And these are really, really good questions. And they almost speak to some of the broader issues with both interpretation and translation. Because even in my own work, using professional translation, I'm not always sure if what I am saying to the translator actually gets interpreted the way that I want, if the question's actually being asked in the right way. And these are the same considerations, right? When we have children translating, when we have even friends sometimes translating for people, right? Is that we're not sure if we always get the right answer from our client, and it's not the client's fault, it's just everything lost in translation, right? With children, it's incredibly difficult. And I think it really, part of it is the age of the child and the maturity of the child themselves in order to engage in the process. What we found in our work is that teenage clients who were translating, interpreting in their teen years felt a bit more comfortable, I would say overall. However, they would also retrospectively tell us that as younger children, this maybe wasn't the case, right? That they had many situations where they felt uncomfortable. And even still, accompanying their parents to sensitive doctor's appointments. For instance, if you're accompanying your mother to a gynecology appointment and having to operate as their interpreter, how do you navigate that, right? So it's interesting. So from an AHS, healthcare perspective, we have to think about legal in that type of thing. And of course, in everyday conversations, that's not always going to be the case. But from an assessment perspective, if I need something for somebody's chart, it has to be legal. And a child interpreting for their parent is not considered legal necessarily. So I do have to have that more kind of formalized interpreter for certain questions. But all of these things still beg this overall question of the quality of interpretation, right? And I certainly don't want anything going on somebody's healthcare record that isn't true. So I think you've asked a very good topic here, Rafi, but I'm not sure if I actually have a good answer for you. Again, when children are translating and interpreting for their parents, it's important to make sure they're comfortable in the interaction. But you're right, they may not necessarily know all of the medical terms. I know for myself in my own practice, again, when I'm having more conversations with family and they're interpreting, I try and keep my language simple and jargon-free. Just to make sure that hopefully this gets across in an easier way rather than especially English. English is full of nuance. Most languages are full of nuance. I really try and use as many concrete terms as I can, simplifying my language, not necessarily making it childish, but simplifying it so that it can be easily understood and perhaps easily translated in languages that perhaps don't translate as well with English, because that's a common problem as well. But yeah, there's no easy way to navigate these phenomena. And I think towards the end of the book, that's really what we get at too, right? Is that it's this very, very big phenomenon. We know it happens, but there's lots of entanglements with it. There's this legal piece, but then there's also this wellness piece on both ends. And then, of course, as providers, are we actually getting the information we need? Long-winded way of saying that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Halley. We have a question from Hubtum. What are the ways to make sure we honor our scope of practice while fulfilling our rules that may demand flexibility?
I feel like I'm talking a lot, but Alesia, I don't know if you have anything that, because I know your work kind of goes into a bit of scope of practice stuff as well, but.
Yeah, I can give it
Yeah.
a shot. I think it very much is a balance from like prior to working in research, I also worked more in community health and bedside and working across the layering of needs that a client has when they come to you and how do we navigate that? What do you prioritize? I think at the end of the day, a lot of things have been said already about like self-care and needing to understand where does your scope end and where would you need to find further resources. But I think that ultimately the scope of our own practice looks different person to person. And sometimes your relationship and rapport with one client looks different from how it'll look from a different client. And that is very much that rapport that you're building. I think key to knowing where you are comfortable and where you stand, there might be certain values that could be at risk of being compromised, is really dependent on how your relationship with your leadership and who can help debrief with you and who can help support you as a practitioner. We recognize that when we talk about scope of practice, it really is not a job description. There's very much more to what we do in our interactions. And for me in my own practice, being able to track that down and for my own, I guess, self-care is writing out all of the things that I'm interacting with and how I'm perceiving things, and then bringing that up with my charge nurse at the time, for example, or whoever has more access to resources beyond me, because sometimes when we are working with a client, we become so, I don't know what the right word is, but you're just so focused on what that client needs that sometimes the bigger picture is missed. So I don't know if I'm really answering this question correctly because I'm drawing from so many different parts of my career, but that flexibility is you, and that the ability to reach out to find the supports you need is a skill in itself, and it takes time to develop. Halley, please jump in and add more to this, but that's my take so far.
No, I think you answered it really well, because I was even thinking about my own practice in the ED, and often we are without a social worker, for instance, in the ED. So then do you then become the de facto social worker? And as a mental health nurse, sometimes the lines are blurred around what social work does and what mental health nursing does. But some of the things I don't deal with child protection, I don't deal with housing, I don't deal with kind of more those community supports. But have I? Absolutely, I have. If we don't have a social worker in the ED, well, I'm not going to let this person leave without getting what they need, right? Otherwise, what's going to happen to this individual? And maybe part of it is my own anxiety, but I also think just systematically, will this just be a bounce back tomorrow to the emergency department, right? Or can I just deal with this now myself? And yes, it's not officially, like you said, in my job description to do these things. Most of what I do is not in my job description, but I do think we can honor this idea of flexibility while still, like you mentioned, and like Grace brought up too, this idea of boundaries. So yes, if we don't have social work available, I will try my best to step in their very, very big shoes to fill. And even if I can just provide that Band-Aid. But if we do, and it's a housing situation, even if I have excellent rapport with that client, I will use my excellent rapport with that client to bring them to the social worker's office and introduce them myself. And then have them do those pieces, because that is it's not my area of expertise, A, and B, I also have other things to do that are within my scope of expertise.
I'd like to add about my scope of practice. For the most part, I try to set healthy boundaries within my patients, but sometimes I do go the extra mile. I do think it is important for nurses to advocate for our patients and help them navigate the system. The system is challenging as it is, and I kind of look back at how I was feeling when I was just in Canada, um, remembering maybe a month, 2 months in, and how everything looks so scary. Um, you know, and as I say, every patient has different and unique challenges that they are facing. But it is also important, to be understanding, compassionate, and going the extra mile within what you can offer to the client. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, Alicia, and Halley, for this very deep and thoughtful sharing of your experience and practice. And I agree totally. And I see how intertwined with the social work practice, settlement workers, nurses. It's all same how we can balance between boundaries, professional boundaries, even personal beliefs, uh, and the needs of the clients and our rapport with the clients or patients. Wonderful, and thank you so much, Amy, for the great statement you added to the chat as well.